Thank you for tuning into this webinar hosted jointly by the Ceres Investor Water Hub and the Ceres Capital Market Systems program called The Business Case for Water Smart Boards, Lessons Learned from State Street Global Advisors and Danone North America. My name is Robin Miller, and I'm a manager at Ceres focused on supporting investor engagement on our water program. This webinar is part of the Investor Water Hub Speaker Series, where we bring together experts from the research, policy, corporate, and investment worlds to unpack how we can better address water risks and opportunities in investment decision-making. This webinar aims to provide insight into the importance of board oversight of material water risks, which sectors are often exposed to material water risks, how investors and companies are addressing these risks, and key resources that Ceres can offer to help investors, companies, and others in this process. I'm delighted to be moderating this webinar with three stellar speakers. I'll keep my introductions of them brief, but you can read their full bios in the reminder that you received for the webinar. So first we'll hear from Caitlin McSherry, Assistant Vice President and ESG Analyst at State Street Global Advisors. Caitlin will set the stage for why investors view board-level oversight of material water risks as a key performance indicator in certain sectors. She'll review more context on R-Factor, which is an ESG scoring system designed by SSGA that measures the performance of a company's business operations and governance as it relates to financially material ESG issues facing the company's industry. Then next, I'll turn it to my colleague Hannah Saltman, who's a manager on our governance program at Ceres. Hannah will highlight Ceres' latest findings on how food and beverage companies are overseeing exposure to water risks from a recently updated interactive online report called Feeding Ourselves Thirsty. Hannah will also provide more grounding from Ceres' thought leadership on how we support corporate boards in adopting effective oversight practices for sustainability. And then finally, the Senior Director of Public Benefit and Sustainable Development at Danone North America, Deanna Bratter, will provide context on the company, its water strategy, and how it currently provides mechanisms of board-level oversight on water-related issues. So a bit of context for those of you who are new to Ceres. For the past 30 years, Ceres has worked with companies, investors, policymakers, and other partners to drive sustainable solutions throughout the economy. As a sustainability nonprofit advocacy organization, we pursue this mission through four extensive networks that you can see on this slide: our investor network, our company network, policy network, and the nonprofit network. This webinar is jointly organized, as I mentioned, by the Investor Water Hub as part of our educational speaker series, and this time we're glad to be collaborating with the Capital Market Systems program here at Ceres. For those of you who are new to this work, the Investor Water Hub is a working group of the Ceres Investor Network. Investor Water Hub provides peer-to-peer support on water risk integration and engagement practices. We have over 100 institutional investors representing more than $20 trillion in assets under management in this group, and we are advised by leading investors and other peer investor networks. Last year, the Investor Water Hub released the Investor Water Toolkit, which is available online as a comprehensive resource on evaluating water risks and investment portfolios. I encourage you to take a look, interact with the data, the case studies, the risk frameworks, and certainly be in touch with the Investor Water Hub team at Ceres to learn more or get involved. So on this slide is an example of how the toolkit provides different frameworks for evaluating water risk. This graphic shows the connections among risk drivers around water, like climate change, weak regulation, failing infrastructure, and water pollution, and how these connect with material business risks and resulting financial impacts. So with these risks in mind, I'll now turn it over to our first speaker, Caitlin McSherry from State Street Global Advisors, to provide insight on how State Street Global Advisors analyzes material water risks across sectors and how the firm works with boards of directors on these key material risks.
Right. Well, thank you all for having me here today. It's great to be a part of this important dialogue. By way of quick background, State Street Global Advisors is a global asset manager with approximately $2.8 trillion in assets under management. We primarily invest through index-based strategies, meaning we serve more or less as near permanent capital. As a result, my team focuses on identifying issues that pose the greatest risks or opportunities to value creation over the long term for our portfolio companies. And water has sort of risen to the top in terms of broader issues as being one of those key topics for a few reasons. So first, it's been identified as a financially material topic by many companies and across various sectors. So for example, the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, or SASB's materiality map, identifies water as a financially material issue in about a third of the industries they look at. Further, of companies responding to CDP's water survey, about 75% cite that they are exposed to some form of water risk. Water-related risks can also have a direct impact on value creation, and these risks can manifest in a number of ways. For example, disrupted supply chains, especially in water-scarce areas, physical damage from extreme weather events such as flooding. We see changes in energy availability, for example, in areas where operations may be dependent on hydroelectric power, limited clean water inputs where local water resources are contaminated through discharge, and lastly, reputational impact and the social license to operate within communities in which water resources are shared with locals. We've seen water as a growing issue of importance across various stakeholder groups. We see companies disclosing it as a material risk. Third parties such as SASB are considering it. It's one of the 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals. It has been the subject of several shareholder proposals, and we see regulators paying more attention, which has been spurred from various water crises, such as the one in Flint, Michigan a few years ago. And for State Street, water has been an engagement priority for the team in recent years, meaning it's a topic that we focus on when we go into engagements with our portfolio companies. And lastly here, just like any material risk, the role of the board in overseeing it is critical. We believe that sustainability risks that are deemed material to the business should be managed just like any other strategic business risk. And as such, we expect boards to understand the potential impacts of that risk, asking questions like, how does water and climate and ESG issues more broadly impact the business? We expect boards to consider risks when planning for the future. Scenario planning can help boards analyze exposure to financially material water risks and assess the potential impacts of different scenarios on strategy. And lastly, we expect boards to integrate material ESG risks such as water into their oversight of long-term strategy and business performance. So receiving regular updates about performance on key operational ESG metrics, such as the ones identified in the SASB standards, offers boards a broader set of information with which to evaluate strategy and incentivize management. The State Street Asset Stewardship team, which I'm a part of, engages with around 700 companies annually. And one challenge we've heard from companies in regard to ESG topics such as water is that different investors and different stakeholders focus on different issues, and that there is no commonly accepted definition of which ESG issues are material for them and how and what they should be disclosing. And from the investor perspective, we require better ESG data to understand how companies are managing sustainability risks and to inform investment decision making. So what we need in order to do this is a common understanding of which ESG issues are financially material and standardized ESG data. And these needs brought us to the creation of R-Factor. R-Factor is an ESG scoring system that leverages multiple data sources and aligns them to widely accepted transparent materiality frameworks such as SASB to generate unique ESG scores for listed companies. It measures the performance of a company's business operations and governance as it relates to financially material ESG challenges facing the company's industry. And it's designed to provide companies a roadmap to improve ESG practices and disclosures to help create sustainable markets. And to illustrate this, I'll use the topic of water and show how it plays a role in R factor. This slide shows a portion of the SASB the SASB materiality map. R factor considers what is financially material for a company based on its industry classification. So for example, the key operational metrics pertaining to water management recommended for one industry may differ from the metrics recommended for another industry. Here we can see that the reporting guidance for the topic of water and waste management for companies in the oil and gas services industry differs from that of the agricultural products industry. And what I like to message to companies and boards when discussing the SASB standards is to view them as the floor, not the ceiling. Consider the standards as baseline disclosures, and feel free to expand and customize from there as appropriate. So in closing, I'd like to circle back to the board's role in oversight of water risk. I touched upon our guidance to boards earlier, but wanted to close with this slide to reiterate that boards have an important role to play in overseeing ESG risks facing their companies and should approach material ESG risks as they would any other material risk to the business to ensure that a company's assets and its long-term business strategy are resilient to the impacts of climate change. So with that, Robin, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, Caitlin, and I will just go through these disclosures I know that are part of your slide deck, but that's really, I think it's great to hear the investor perspective of how State Street Global Advisors is approaching this, recognizing that there are lots of different indicators and metrics out there, and it's great to have something like R factor, which is looking at the key mapping of materiality across the sectors. So a reminder as well that if you have any questions, please send them our way through the chat feature so that we can take that into account when we get to the Q&A at the end of the webinar. And I'm pleased to introduce our next speaker, who is my colleague, Hannah Saltman, Manager on the Governance Program at Ceres. And Hannah is going to share more about some resources that we have at Ceres to help investors and companies better address sustainability issues and some specific to water at the board level. So Hannah, you can take it away.
Great. Thanks so much, Robin. Thanks, Caitlin. And hello to everyone. It's great to be on the webinar with you today. So as Robin stated, my name is Hannah Saltman, and I'm a manager at Ceres on our corporate governance program. So to kick us off, the goal of our governance program is to move corporate boards to make better decisions for sustainability performance improvements. And we focus on boards, as Caitlin noted, due to their immense leadership potential. They sit at the top of a company's organizational structure. They have the power to hire, fire, and incentivize management. Their networks are also significant, meaning that as the average corporate director sits on multiple boards, when you engage one corporate director, you're likely affecting the boardroom discussions across multiple corporations. And of course, the final point, which is that investors are increasingly interested not just on a company's commitment to relevant sustainability issues, but specifically they're focused on the role of the board in overseeing management on these topics. As fiduciaries to shareholders, directors face increasing asks from shareholders to demonstrate that they are serving their director duty as stewards of short and long-term value creation. So the foundation of our program really rests on the collateral that we've developed in identifying best practices for how boards can oversee sustainability, which is we've largely developed through interviews with directors, investors, and other corporate governance professionals. So our institutional strategy that you can see on this slide really leverages these best practices we've identified in delivering presentations to boards, investors, and in-house corporate counsel that of course play a pivotal role in advising the board. Our individual strategy engages directors as individuals, as boards are ultimately made up of people. So to do this, we partner with major director associations, such as the National Association of Corporate Directors, to feature our collateral to their network of over 20,000 U.S. corporate directors. So moving to the next slide, this really gets to the heart of why it matters that boards oversee sustainability, and also how we're seeing that directors still by and large really aren't doing this. So as we know, and as we just heard from Caitlin, climate change and other sustainability issues pose clear business risks and opportunities. And of course, the latest IPCC report has highlighted that action is needed more urgently than ever, along with the World Economic Forum's Global Risk Report. With some of the largest asset owners and asset managers calling directly for boards to be competent on climate and sustainability, we're seeing that the financial community is continuing to call for focus on these issues as business issues. However, you'll see on the right side of the slide that in a recent survey of U.S. corporate directors, just 6% saw climate change as having an impact on the company over the next 12 months. And in addition, in an additional survey done by PwC, 56% of directors surveyed also say that shareholder attention to ESG issues is overblown, which is up from 29% last year. So then moving to the next slide, when we combine these elements together, we really see a strong business case for why boards need to understand how climate and sustainability impact their business. Namely that, one, these issues can be material to corporations over a variety of time frames. Two, when a sustainability issue is material to a company, directors have a responsibility to educate themselves on the issue before making business decisions. And three, that investors understand and are calling for boards to demonstrate what they are doing to oversee the integration of these topics within the company's strategy and risk management structures in order to safeguard their invested assets and advance value creation. So on this next slide, we're going to dive into a recently released report that my colleague Robin teed up in the beginning of the webinar called Feeding Ourselves Thirsty. So Ceres recently released Feeding Ourselves Thirsty, which is an analysis of 40 food companies across industries with the highest exposure to water risk, which include agricultural products, beverages, meat, and packaged foods. The benchmark analyzed these 40 companies across 4 key areas. First is governance and strategy. Second is direct operations. The third is manufacturing supply chain. And the fourth is agricultural supply chain. So if we really dial into some of the governance metrics, we get to see a picture of how the boards of these companies are specifically identifying and overseeing issues of water scarcity and risk. So on the graph here, you'll see that we saw a jump in how many companies now designate a board committee that is regularly briefed on water risks and strategy. So in total this year, there were 14 companies that fell into this bucket, which was up from just 4 the last time that we did this benchmark in 2017. So in 2019, an additional 14 companies have a board committee that oversees sustainability more broadly, and then the remaining 12 lack any kind of formal board oversight of sustainability. So when we review the actions that were taken by the board on these issues, the data is a little bit more mixed. So while the majority of companies analyzed now formally factor water into major business planning decisions such as acquisitions and capital investments, less than a third of companies evaluated link executive compensation to achieving water goals or performance on other sustainability issues. Additionally, when we're talking about water risk assessment, while more than 2/3 of companies now conduct water risk assessments for their agricultural supply chains, the scope and rigor of these assessments are often limited and do not take into account risks from agricultural runoff, impaired ecosystems, regulatory risks, and concerns of local stakeholders. So on the next slide, we really get into how can boards oversee water risk in an effective and strong way. So of course, I'll kick off this slide with a shameless plug alert. So building on much of the collateral that our governance program has published on how boards can oversee sustainability issues broadly, a week from tomorrow on November 20th, we're publishing a new report that's specifically focused on how boards can oversee risks posed by ESG issues, including water. So this slide is a quick preview of our key findings, and of course these recommendations can be used to apply specifically to water risk or ESG-related risks more broadly. So the first step that boards need to integrate into their oversight really deals with the identification stage within the risk assessment process. So starting from the beginning, boards really need to be posing the right questions to management to ensure that a range of sources are consulted to determine what ESG risks may be facing the company and how these risks are integrated within a company's enterprise risk management system. In the next stage, boards need to have a close review of the results of a company's materiality assessment on ESG issues and ensure that they're regularly briefed on prioritized ESG risks that are deemed material to the corporation. And then once boards understand which material ESG risks are a priority, they need to adapt business strategy and examine incentive structures accordingly to really understand and make the company resilient to the realization of such risks. And finally, we all know that the classic adage of what gets measured gets managed is critical to the role of the board as well. So not only do boards need to develop the right systems at the board level to oversee ESG risks, including formal inclusion of sustainability within a board committee charter, director expertise on sustainability, and executive compensation linkage, but they need to drive adequate disclosure of these systems as well. Investors and other stakeholders really need to be able to understand what accountability systems for ESG risk exist at the board level to understand how the company is ready or will be ready in the face of these risks. So ultimately, with their role as stewards of long-term corporate value and their responsibility to hold management accountable for corporate resilience in the face of disruptive risks, boards are really in a clear position to drive performance. And the last element that I'll flag here for this latest report is that within each one of these buckets for how a board can oversee the risks posed by ESG issue, identification, assessment, action, structure, and disclosure, the report will flag between 1 to 3 questions that boards can be asking management within each one of these buckets. It's a primer specifically for corporate directors, but it can also be used by investors to drive that kind of conversation with portfolio companies. Robin, back to you.
Great. Thank you, Hannah. And it was good to get that high-level overview, but also some of those specific examples. And I'm really excited for the report coming out next week. So moving on to our final speaker, and just a plug, if you have questions, we've been getting some good questions in, but please send your questions our way through the chat feature or raise your hand, and one of us will call on you. But I will now turn it over to Deanna Bratter, the Senior Director of Public Benefit and Sustainable Development at Danone North America, who's going to give some more background on Danone's corporate focus, its water strategy, and how the company currently uses mechanisms of board-level oversight on water-related issues.
Great. Thank you. I'm pleased to be here today to share a bit about Danone, who we are, and how we approach water risk and water management from both governance, oversight, and incentivizing throughout our organization. Danone has a unique health-focused portfolio across food and beverage, and our mission is to bring health through food to as many people as possible. We also have a shared vision focused on one planet, one health, and the interconnectivity that health of people and health of the planet are connected and must thrive together in order to grow. Our business is focused on 3 segments. The majority is in essential dairy and plant-based, which is just over 50% of our total business portfolio, and we are #1 worldwide in fresh dairy products and plant-based products. We also have a business unit focused on specialized nutrition, which includes infant and medical nutrition, as well as a waters business, including Evian and packaged waters around the globe. I always like to show our North American portfolio when I'm speaking with primarily North American audiences. Danone is less known as a corporate name in the U.S., but our products across a variety of areas are well known and hopefully in most refrigerators. While Danone is celebrating a 100-year anniversary this year, we are an organization who has had 3 CEOs in our legacy. And our vision has actually been consistent since our beginning, focused on the idea of a dual project and a commitment to both business success and social progress. That comes to life in many ways, but initially with a vision that our responsibility doesn't end at our factory gates, and that we have a responsibility beyond the creation and manufacturing of our products to bring benefits to society. That eventually evolved into the idea of focusing and streamlining our portfolio to categories that provided that social benefit through healthful choices for a variety of consumers. Most recently, with Emmanuel Faber, our current CEO, the vision has come to life with the idea that each time we eat and drink, we can vote for the world we want to live in. This really starts to focus on the idea that our consumers and our customers are drivers for our ability to create change. And the more people are selecting products that are working to have a powerful impact on both the environment and society, the more change we can collectively create while growing our business. Specifically, I like to share this quote because I think it really speaks to the idea that eating habits are changing, and the values that our consumers are looking for in their lives, they're also attaching to their food choices. So there's a growing expectation for both integrity and transparency for all food products, both those that are grounded in local cultures. And we see the beginning of a food revolution that we are absolutely committed to being part of. This comes to life through our commitment to the planet. So I wanted to give a brief overview of what that looks like in practice. We focus on a couple of pillars around our strategy and commitments, and we refer to them as our cycles. So our carbon cycle. We have a commitment to become a carbon neutral company across our full value chain by 2050. We also have a deep connection with our water cycle to protect and value water as an essential resource for Danone and local communities. We also are focused on circular economy and packaging, specifically with a commitment to have 100% reusable, recyclable, or compostable by 2025. Our goal is to keep materials in use and out of nature, as well as to reduce food waste across the globe. Specific to agriculture, we often refer to this as our milk cycle, as the majority of our business is connected to milk and dairy. And our goal is to foster regenerative agriculture practices that protect our soils, promote animal welfare, and empower a new generation of farmers. Some of our most recent results across our health, social, and environmental performance include that focus I mentioned before around focusing on healthy categories, which is 89% of our business. To date, we've reduced over 15% of our CO2 emissions intensity on our full scope. I'm going to skip over here to mention that 87% of our packaging is currently recyclable, reusable, or compostable on a global scale, and we do have that 100% by 2025 goal we are working against. We also have a lot of social focus, one of the key stats being that 50% of our managers, directors, and executives are women. Speaking to this centerpiece, I'm going to talk a little bit about B Corp on the next slide. I wanted to share our 2030 goals from Danone globally. This is the focus areas for our business, centered on growing our brands and overall business growth, but grounded in some critical components, including serving that food revolution with partners, and that includes NGOs like peers on the call, as well as other partners on the ground in the areas we operate, fostering inclusive growth, such as with our work with the OECD and Business for Inclusive Growth. We are also focused on being certified as a B Corp and preserving and renewing the planet's resources, being the pillar focused on our environmental performance. A quick moment here on B Corp. B Corp is an independent third-party certification that any for-profit entity can achieve. Currently, Danone North America is the largest certified B Corp in the world, and that is our North American business, which is roughly 20% of our global organization. Danone globally has committed as part of those 2030 goals and ambitions to become a B Corp, and currently over 30% of our global turnover is certified as a B Corp, with more progressing every year. What a B Corp is a group of companies or an individual company as part of a movement of companies who are looking to redefine success in business. And what that looks like is this concept of people using business as a force for good. So the assessment itself is a set of questions that a company can answer to understand both a benchmark of where its performance is over a variety of social and environmental questions, as well as what best practice looks like and ways to improve. This includes a focus area on environment, including inputs, outputs, commitments, risk assessments, and more. As being part of a B Corp, we have access to a community of leaders who are also working to further embed all of this good work while still being keenly focused on being a business and providing benefit and impact business models to the world. Focusing in a bit on our Preserve and Renew the Planet's Resources focus area for our 2030 goals. We work to align and understand how our objectives and focus areas for our business contribute to the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and you can see them there at the bottom. We also strive to be a game changer or a catalyst to foster positive solutions for the planet. We have commitments around sustainable sourcing for our ingredients, as well as circular economy for both food and for packaging. We have a very robust regenerative agriculture program that is being co-developed with farmers and partners that will help us amplify our water stewardship programs and journey. We are absolutely committed to doing our part in the fight against climate change and implementing carbon positive solutions and aiming to achieve that carbon neutrality by 2050 ambition that we've set forward. Going a bit deeper on our water policy and focus. So specific to water-related ecosystems, respecting natural water cycle and participating in efforts to support SDG 6. We have 4 pillars to our strategy, which focus on water resources and ecosystems, water and agriculture, water and operations, and water access. We act where there is the most risks, as water scarcity can constrain our business growth, and we need water to both produce our products or the ingredients that are part of our products and grow key commodities such as milk, nuts, and fruits. As all of our business divisions depend on water both directly and indirectly, we have a robust company-wide water policy. When we focus in on water resources and ecosystems, our goal is to protect and restore our watersheds and natural ecosystems where we operate, especially in water-stressed areas. We do this through water funds that create collective financial and governance mechanisms which bring together public, farmer, NGO, industrial, and civil society stakeholders around a common goal of strengthening our water security through integrated watershed management. When it comes to water and agriculture, we're working directly with farmers, agricultural communities, and key suppliers to develop and promote regenerative agriculture practices that are maximizing water efficiency and preserving water quality. We have a program currently focused on regenerative agriculture and a focus on soil health for nearly 50,000 acres across our dairy supply chain, including feed for animals. This is focused on the benefits of both soil health, water resiliency and quality, improving biodiversity, as well as carbon and energy through enhancing soils to sequester more carbon. We are also keenly focused on economics and productivity to ensure returns and sustainable futures for our farmers and partners. When it comes to water and operations, we have a company water target to reduce water use in operations and return all wastewater clean to natural ecosystems. We have strict water discharge thresholds defined by our internal clean water standards, and we ensure efficiency practices are funded and supported through our capital programs across the business for our many manufacturing facilities, more than 15 in the U.S. alone. Specific to water access, we want to ensure that we are working with local opportunities to provide water access, sanitation, and hygiene to all of our employees and all of the people that we touch through our production across the globe. We also acknowledge the human right to water and sanitation and use this as an insight as we operate and grow our business. Moving on to address our specifics on board responsibility for water-related issues. As part of those 2030 goals on water-related specific issues, they are under responsibility of the highest level of the organization, including our CEO and chairman, our Social Responsibility Committee, which is a board-level committee, and our Chief Financial Officer. In this capacity, the CEO organizes and leads the work of the board, including that Social Responsibility Committee. And that committee is responsible with reviewing the environmental policies, roadmap, and performance, and it reports through the CEO out to the shareholders meeting, annual shareholders meeting. Additionally, we have a variety of stakeholders who are engaged in specific oversight. So our environmental strategy is sponsored by our Executive Vice President, who is our Chief Financial Officer over IS and IT, our services and technology, and our cycles and procurement, who sits on the Executive Committee and on the Board of Directors. We also have several governance bodies involved in implementing and reviewing our environmental strategy, including, again, the Chairman and the CEO and that Executive Vice President, and the Social Responsibility Committee and the Executive Committee. That Social Responsibility Committee focuses mainly on our action principles, our policies and practices in several areas, including environment, related to activities controlled directly from industrial production and packaging, or indirectly, such as purchasing, transportation, or energy, and the use of non-renewable natural resources. Specific on water-related issues, it is also under the responsibility of these directors, and their main responsibility lies in reviewing the risks for Danone in each specific environmental area where we operate, considering the challenges of geographic-specific impacts and its mission and activities in those regions. Let's see. So the governance bodies as well are focused on conducting quarterly review of our environmental roadmaps with water-related issues included, and assessing key challenges and how the company is implementing and improving against the strategies that set forward. We know in today's world, many companies are setting commitments, and we believe a key strategy of advancing and continuing to lead our business forward in this is to ensure that we have regular check-ins promoting our improvement and challenges in each of these areas as they move forward. We also have a focus on specific mechanisms throughout the business, including monitoring the implementation and performance, overseeing CapEx related to these improvements and efficiency and improvement programs, providing employee incentives, reviewing and guiding annual budgets, reviewing and guiding business plans, and a variety more, including how we look at our innovation portfolio and our research and development priorities and the impacts those have on the environment as we continue to be focused on growth. When it comes to incentives specifically, we do have a program tied to financial resources. So there's variable annual compensation for the chairman, which is focused half on economic component, 20% on social, environmental, and societal performance against a variety of targets we've set forth, including our water commitments, and 30% on business development objectives. The environmental components are weighed at 10% of the total variable compensation and includes water usage reduction and water discharge quality targets by 2020 and new targets as we approach 2020 set for 2025 and 2030. We also have a variety of key performance indicators specific to our water performance, including specific reduction of water withdrawals, and this is site-specific, reduction in consumptive volumes, reduction of product water intensity, and efficiency targets, both on direct operations and downstream in our value chain, as well as upstream in the value chain. So this speaks to the work we're doing with our farmers and the audits that we have both through internal tools and programs and leveraging external tools and programs. Supply chain engagement in this work and ensuring that there is a shared understanding of both our goal, our commitments, and our accountability through our suppliers to implement programs is critical, as well as a workplace safety program focused on water and water-related community projects. So I gave you a lot of information there. I wanted to close by saying that the One Planet, One Health vision for the company comes to life in a variety of areas. And as we focus directly on our carbon cycle, our water cycle, our milk cycle, and our plastic cycles, we hope to continue to bridge the gap with the understanding that business, especially large business, has an incredibly important role to play in our sustainability journey, in the realization of the Sustainable Development Goals, and in our own mission to continue bringing health through food to as many people as possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Deanna. It was great to have such a comprehensive overview of the company, how you approach water, how that integrates into the broader strategy, and some of those very specific measures about how that's integrated into the board level oversight. So thank you for sharing those insights. And now we will turn to a question and answer period. So thank you to all of you who submitted questions throughout the webinar. We also had a few questions that were submitted before the webinar. So we will go ahead and turn to that. As a refresher as well, on the slide now you can see where you can ask your own question if you'd like. So we'll have about 10 minutes for a question and answer, and then we will wrap up. So I do want to start with a question to Hannah. I know you mentioned that the new report will have some examples of key questions that board risk committees can ask management around water risk. Can you give some examples of some of those questions?
Sure. So, as I noted, the report really structures how a board can oversee these risks in three major buckets. So across identification, assessment, and adaptation or mitigation phase of the risk assessment process and decision making for the board. So, for example, within the identification section, right, we'd have one recommendation on consider how ESG risks could affect your company. So directors could ask questions like, what kinds of risks could ESG issues pose? How could these risks interrelate, and when could these risks manifest? So, what's interesting is in some of the background research that we did for this report, ESG, particularly around the environmental and social side of things, have typically been thought of as not having a financial impact on the business. And as of course, we've seen from the presentations on this webinar alone, that's not the case. One of the couple themes we've seen is that a lot of these risks can interrelate and actually pose a much more significant impact to business when they're occurring together or as risk multipliers. That also gets into what time frame is considered as a part of the identification or even assessment phase of the risk assessment process. So that's really something that directors want to be asking management as well when, a scenario analysis or a heat map of risks falls on their desk, to really understand how it was conducted, what sources of information were used to really identify what the key risks or the material risks are that face the business. And I think the last thing that I'll flag as another question that we've really pulled out for directors to ask is, not just what external sources, but what ESG issues do our top investors think are most relevant to our sector? And I think that ties back to what Caitlin overviewed with the R factor. Really pulling and thinking through not just what the internal assessment has yielded, but what our investors are asking, or even what are our corporate peers doing on ESG risks.
Great. Caitlin or Deanna, any additional insight to add on that?
No, I think those questions are excellent, and what's really important in terms of providing these types of resources to board members and management teams, and also to investors who may be engaging, is that by asking these types of questions, you're reinforcing the importance of the topic and that it should be elevated on the agenda for boards to consider, and that once they do realize the importance of the issue, not only does it then flow into strategic considerations, but also then it fosters the discussion around, how is oversight being structured of this risk internally? What type of infrastructure do we need to establish to make sure we are tracking the correct key performance indicators or other types of measurements to, I think, Hannah, to get back to what you said before, what gets measured gets managed. So making sure that companies are laying the groundwork to ensure that water-related topics are being managed appropriately.
Great. And Caitlin, we had a question come in on that note around if there is water deemed a material risk and a company doesn't have those structures in place, what is your approach? Do you put the company on an engagement list, or how do you think about helping that company on this kind of path of water stewardship?
Yeah, certainly. So, I mean, unfortunately, the state of disclosure right now, not only are we lacking in, quality of standardized reporting, but we're also lacking in quantity of ESG reporting. So by utilizing SASB in the creation of R-Factor, we're giving companies insight into how we are measuring their performance and disclosure of key ESG risks. And from, with R-Factor, not only is that information being shared with our investment teams, but it's also being integrated into our stewardship program. So exactly to the question, how is it coming through in our asset stewardship efforts? One example is we'll be using R-Factor in determining, as a consideration in determining which companies we speak to and which topics specifically to focus on with them. And similarly, how can we bring quality of disclosure and management of this risk into voting considerations as well when it comes time to voting our proxies.
Great, thanks, Caitlin. And Deanna, we've had a few questions come in around water stewardship and Danone's approach, and whether, specific to integrated watershed management, is this something that's done within the existing governance structures that you outlined, or is it, are there other internal processes in place around the integrated watershed management?
Absolutely. So each one of our regions across the globe has the opportunity to develop, not just the opportunity, but the requirement to develop a localized water strategy looking specifically at watersheds we are impacting or impacted by our business. And if they are not at risk, we still are exploring how we can support or preserve to ensure they stay that way. Specifically in the U.S., the Colorado River, as well as the San Joaquin Valley, where we source the majority of our almonds across the globe, and all of the almonds for our North American business, which is in California, and certainly an area of extreme water stress. So on a localized regional level, we have programs to really understand what we're faced with and what to look at. As a global organization, you can imagine that the focus area of water access becomes much more real and critical in certain regions where the water in operations or the water in agriculture are a bit more of a focus for here in the U.S. Because I do work for the Danone North American business, it's a bit easier for me to answer within that context, but hopefully it brings a bit of life to how we take those insights and the strategy from the highest level and implement them more locally.
Great, thank you. One of the questions that we got prior to the webinar was stressing that water scarcity receives a lot of attention, Deanna, kind of as you were talking about, in places that are already depleted. And this person was wondering, is the next wave of risk management going to include more proactive measures about water security, and what about nutrient pollution and runoff and water quality issues? What do you foresee in terms, this can go to any of the speakers, but in terms of how those risks might be something that the board can address?
Absolutely. I think for Danone, a robust board program and a secure water strategy is looking for what's coming next. I think nutrients in water, specifically in discharge, is absolutely something we're looking more deeply at. I think when it comes to understanding our risk and getting really close at that regional level, it starts to get very clear where we have risks that we need to lean in on, where the greatest risks are, and what the biggest opportunities are. And we need to be very tailored. Water is so location-specific, geographic-specific, community-specific. And we want to make sure that when we are looking at water scarcity as a whole, we are addressing both inputs and outputs. So how we're using the water and then how it's being discharged. If it's going into nature, what is the nutrient load and what are the impacts of that? In North America specifically, we have some really interesting, innovative practices that we're supporting. For example, when it comes to dairy farming, the nutrient load of wastewater in that process, especially with animal agriculture and wastewater is quite heavy. And so we're working on several technologies of filtering water and using drip irrigation out in fields to grow feed that then goes back to our cows. So it's an example of where we understand that the nutrients can be beneficial to the land in this case, but there is not adequate ways to get the right balance out to the fields at the right times. And so we're focused on innovative solutions around water reuse, so decreasing our overall water need, especially in water-stressed areas, and then innovative solutions to get those nutrients out to where they can actually be of use instead of a negative or a pollutant.
Great. Thanks, Deanna. It's great to know kind of what's on the horizon. Hannah or Caitlin, anything else to add on that question?
This is Hannah. I think that piggybacking on what Deanna just said, I touched on this a bit in my remarks, but when the Feeding Ourselves Thirsty analysis came out in terms of what was contained in the water risk assessments that the universe of 40 companies had done, it really hadn't taken into account risks from agricultural runoff, impaired ecosystems, concerns of local stakeholders, et cetera, on the whole. And so, when I look at that, and also when I look at, I think, generally where boards are on overseeing ESG risks, I think it's mostly that at this stage, a lot of directors have, of course, heard of ESG. They understand that it's likely something that investors are asking for. There's a tension on it, but they're not exactly sure, how they as directors should be overseeing it or when it's important to be discussed on the board agenda. So I think this is where, leading with materiality is really critical. So for companies where issues not just around water scarcity but also water pollution are coming to the fold as a material risk, that's certainly something that the board needs to be briefed on. And then I think the assessment phase, the oversight, the building that into boardroom decision making will follow from there.
Great, thanks, Hannah. So I think that we are definitely approaching our time. So I know that we had many more questions come in that we could address. So we'll do our best to follow up with folks. But thank you for sending in so many great questions. So as we wrap, just reminding you all the goals of the webinar were to provide some insight into the importance of board oversight of material water risks, and to provide some space to discuss how investors and companies are addressing these risks. And we've also highlighted some key resources that Ceres offers to help investors, companies, and many other stakeholders in this process. So one thing I would be remiss if I didn't mention is that Ceres in our Investor Water Toolkit does have a sector analysis on water risk that includes an overlay of SASB. So we will be sure to share out a link to that as a really great complement to the resources that Caitlin shared out with our factor and State Street Global Advisors. So if you would like to, if you have any lingering questions or you want to get involved in our work, please reach out. My contact information is in the bottom left of this slide, and I will also be sending out a follow-up to all of you who have tuned in with a link to the recording, the slides that we've shared, and also links to many of these key resources, including Feeding Ourselves Thirsty, all of the reports that Hannah mentioned, and as I said, some of the resources in the toolkit. So I do want you all to save the date for December 10th for the webinar that will be specifically reviewing Feeding Ourselves Thirsty and some of those key findings. Hannah provided some really great overviews that were specific to the board level oversight of water risk, but there's a lot more in Feeding Ourselves Thirsty to dig into, pun intended, around water risks in the agriculture sector. So I'll be sending out a registration link for that as well in the follow-up, and I hope that you all tune in. So as we close, I want to thank you all for your time and attention during the webinar, and a very special thanks to our speakers, Caitlin, Hannah, and Deanna, for sharing their insights on what I think is a very pressing and important issue. We all need water to survive and thrive, and companies, investors, policymakers, and other stakeholders, we all have a role to play in making sure that water receives the attention and the oversight that it needs to sustain as a key resource. So please reach out to any of us on the Investor Water Hub team at Ceres, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day.